Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third chapter in obligations and contract. So, here, our next topic is the different types of obligation. So, first, we have the pure obligation. Okay. So, when we say pure obligation, here, the effectivity or extinguishment does not depend on the fulfillment or non fulfillment of a condition or on the expiration of a term or period and is immediately demandable. So, sabi, dito sa pure obligation, obligation is immediately demandable when it is pure, when it is subject to a resolutory condition, or subject to a resolutory period. Okay. So when we say pure obligation, this is one which is not subject to any condition and no specific date is mentioned or for its fulfillment and is therefore immediately demandable. Conditional obligation. So there are two types of conditional obligation. We have suspensive condition and we have resolutory condition. So when we say suspensive condition, its happening gives rise to the obligation. Okay. So when we say resolutory condition, its happening extinguishes the obligation. So let me give you a clearer example or picture of it. In a suspensive condition, for example, the condition is um, A will give a car to B, assuming that B passed the bar exam. So it's suspensive because the obligation will happen if B will pass the bar exam. Okay, it's suspensive. Suspended pa yung obligasyon, hindi pa gagawin yung obligasyon until such time that B have fulfilled the condition. Okay. So, that is stated in Article 1181. While in resolutory condition, mawawala na yung obligasyon niya once na nangyari na yung kondisyon. For example, A will stop paying the tuition fee after B graduated. So, dahil nag-graduate na si B, which is yun yung condition, then titigil na si A magbayad ng tuition fee. Okay. In a suspensive condition, it does not take place. If it does not take place, the tie of law does not appear. While in resolutory condition, if it does not take place, the tie of law is consolidated. In suspensive, the acquisition of rights until it takes place, existence of obligation is a mere hope. While in B, in resolutory condition, the loss of rights already acquired, its effects flow, but over it hovers the possibility of termination. Okay. Suspensive conditions, demandability of the obligation is suspended until it's happening. So you can check Central Philippines University versus CA. Yan. So, effects of failure to comply with the condition. So, we have perfection of a contract, which results in the failure of the contract. Okay, in terms of performance of the obligation, it gives the other party an option to refuse to proceed with the compliance of the obligation or to waive the condition. So, pwede daw na it's either ibigay niya, mag-comply siya dun sa obligasyon niya, or i-waive na lang na yung condition. Okay. Article 1156, where the obligation of either party to a contract of sale is subject to any condition which is not performed, such party may refuse to proceed with the contract or he may waive performance of the condition. So now let's talk about obligations with a period. In obligations with a period, those whose demandability or extinguishment is subject to the expiration of a term or period. So, ito medyo self-explanatory ito. Obligations with a period. Okay? May period, may binibigay na interval of time. Okay? May panahon na ibinibigay, which exerting an influence on an obligation as a consequence of a juridical act either suspends its demandability or produce its extinguishment. So the requisites, it must be future, it must be certain, it must be possible, legally and physically. So when obligation is demandable at once, kailan ba yon? Kapag daw iyon ay pure obligations, it's immediately demandable. If it's obligations with a resolutory condition, with a resolutory term, or with the condition not to do an impossible thing. Okay. Kinds of condition, we have potestative, we have casual, and we have mixed. So when we say potestative condition, it's suspensive in nature and which depends upon the sole will of one of the contracting parties. Okay, one of the contracting parties. If we say casual condition, if the suspensive condition depends upon the chance or will of the third person, the obligation subject to it is valid. Okay? So, sa pag-casual kasi, will of a third person. Kapag naman mixed, fulfillment of the condition depends on the will of a party to the obligation and party on chance and or will of a third person. So, yan. Okay. Potestative condition, when it depends exclusively upon the will of the creditor, the condition and obligation is valid inasmuch as creditor is interested in the fulfillment. When it depends exclusively upon the will of debtor, in case of a suspensive condition, condition and obligation are void. So, void na daw yun kung nagdedepende yun kay debtor. So, to allow such condition would be sanction illusory obligation in direct contravention of the principle announced in 1308. Okay. So, you can read SCBTC versus C.A. Ferrer. So, Katonggal versus Rodriguez. Yan. Sabi dito, when it depends exclusively upon the will of debtor in case of a resolutory condition, condition and obligation is valid, and possession of the debtor is exactly the same as the creditor in a suspensive condition and does not render the obligation illusory. So, babasa natin yan, explanations niyan sa madaming cases. Effects of impossible conditions. Okay. So, actually, there are two types of impossibility. So, we can say it can be physically impossible. So, when they are in the nature of things, cannot exist or cannot be undone. And we have legal impossibility when they are contrary to laws, morals, good customs, public order, or public policy. The effects are, first, in conditional obligation, it can be void. Kasi both obligor has no intention to comply with this obligation knowing it cannot be fulfilled. So, the rule is different in conditional testamentary dispositions. So, yun. Number 1. The obligation can be valid if negative condition, like for example, not to do, it is disregarded, rendering the obligation pure and valid. Okay. And number 3, the effects could be that only the affected obligation is void. So, if divisible obligation, the part not affected by the impossible condition is valid. And only the condition void if the obligation is pre-existing and therefore does not depend upon the fulfillment of the impossible conditions for its existence, only the condition is void. So, void. So, ayan ah. So, number 1, both obligation and condition are void. Number 2, if condition is negative, it is disregarded and obligation is rendered pure and valid. Number 3, if obligation is divisible, yung part na hindi naman affected ng impossible condition shall be valid. Okay. And then, only the condition is void if the obligation is pre-existing. So, yan. So, these are different types of effects of impossible condition. Okay. Condition not considered not imposed. If impossible condition is attached for a simple or remunatory donation as well as to a testamentary disposition, condition is considered not imposed when the obligation is valid. The impossibility of the condition must exist at the time of the creation of the obligation. A supervening impossibility does not affect the existence of the obligation. So, ayan. In Cruz versus Gasilian, it's stated that considering that the tract of land was originally stony and partly forested, the condition that it be totally cultivated is an impossible one which the law does not countenance. So, kapag impossible yung condition, hindi talaga siya applicable. Ayan. So, effects of positive and negative condition. In positive condition, obligation is extinguished as soon as the time expires or if it becomes indubitable that the event will not take place. So, yun siya, positive condition. In a negative condition, the obligation is effective from the moment the time indicated has lapsed or if it has become evident that the event cannot occur, although the time indicated has not lapsed. So, sabi kay Article 1184, the condition that some event happen at a time determinate shall extinguish the obligation as soon as the time expires or it has become indubitable that the event will not take place. So, positive or negative condition is different from positive or negative obligation. So, the doctrine of constructive fulfillment of suspensive condition. Sige nga, try to read in your own. Sige, read out loud. Okay, start now. Okay. So, in Article 1186, the condition shall be deemed fulfilled when the obligor voluntarily prevents its fulfillment. So, this provision refers to the constructive fulfillment of a suspensive condition and whose application calls for two requisites, namely, number 1, the intent of the obligor to prevent the fulfillment of the condition, and number 2, to the actual prevention of the fulfillment. So, mere intention of the debtor to prevent the happening of the condition or to place ineffective obstacles to its compliance without actually preventing the fulfillment is insufficient. Okay. So, ang requisites nito, the condition must be suspensive. The debtor actually prevents the fulfillment of the condition and he acts voluntarily. So, the reason is that one must not profit by his own fault. Okay? So, tandaan natin, doctrine of constructive fulfillment of suspensive condition. Fulfilled na yon when the obligor actually prevented the obligee from complying with the condition. Next, constructive fulfillment. Okay. It's the mere intention of the debtor to prevent the happening of the condition or to place ineffective obstacles to its compliance. So, hinaharangan niya without actually preventing fulfillment is insufficient. Principle of retroactivity in suspensive condition. So, ayan. Retroactivity. Okay. The principle of retroactivity under Article 1187 is that the effects of a conditional obligation to give, once the condition has been fulfilled, shall retroact to the day of the constitution of the obligation. Okay, so nevertheless, when the obligations gives reciprocal prestations under the parties, the fruits and interest during the pendency of the condition shall be deemed to have been mutually compensated. If the obligation is unilateral, the debtor shall appropriate the fruits and interest received. Unless from the nature and circumstances of the obligation, it should be inferred that the intention of the person constituting the same was different. In obligations to do and not to do, the courts shall determine in each case the retroactive effect of the condition that has been complied with. Okay. Rule in retroactivity has no application to real contracts since they are perfected only by the delivery of the object of the obligation. So, principle only applies to consensual contracts. Contracts in which the obligation arising therefrom can only be realized within the successive periods or intervals, lease, hire of service, or life annuity. Sige. Nakibasa po out loud. Okay, so it deals with priority of rights. Retroactive effect as to the fruits and interests and obligations to give. Retroactive effect as to the fruits and interests and obligations to give. So in reciprocal obligations, there's no retroactivity, mutually compensated, and fruits may be natural, industrial, or civil. While in unilateral obligations, no retroactivity, debtor appropriates the fruits and interest received because it is usually gratuitous unless intention was otherwise as inferred from the nature and circumstances. So in accordance with Article 1164, fruits only to be right of creditor at the time of delivery, hence subject to suspensive condition. Okay? So Article 1188. So, creditor may before the fulfillment of condition bring appropriate action for the preservation of his right. Ayun. So, kahit daw hindi pa na-fulfill yung obligation sa kanya, pwede daw siyang mag-bring ng appropriate action for the preservation of his right. So, no preference of credit is granted to the creditor. Right of debtor before fulfillment of the condition. May recover what he paid by mistake before the happening of the suspensive condition. Payment was determinate thing. May file action rein vindicatoria. Payment for generic, which is solution in debiti, yung mangyayari. Payment made with knowledge of condition. So, debtor impliedly waives condition and cannot recover. And payment with knowledge but condition did not happen. The debtor can recover less creditor will be unjustly enriched. Okay. Payment not by mistake, debtor impliedly waived condition which he cannot recover until what he has prematurely paid once suspensive condition is fulfilled. Alright guys, so for now, hanggang dito muna yung ating discussion. On our next video, we will discuss effects of loss, deterioration, and improvement in real obligations. So medyo mahaba itong chapter na to, that's why we are dividing the discussion. So I hope that you do read the cases that we mentioned earlier, and if you are reading other more materials, it would be better because you will appreciate it once you have read a lot of it talaga. And then, use this video as a guide, okay, for the topic, okay? So again, thank you so much and stay tuned.